Are you curious about tubes? Or maybe you just want a tube headphone amplifier? Hey everybody, this is Nick from Nick's Listening Space. Today we're going to take a look at the FOSI Audio GR70 headphone preamplifier. Hey guys, so I'm really loving this thing, and I'll just kind of jump in and talk about build quality. So I think the build quality here is completely adequate for this price point. At $200, what you're given here is a really great experience. I think the volume knobs and as well as the tone controls have a decent amount of tactility and a decent amount of force feedback to really present itself as a much more serious piece of equipment than you might believe it to be. On the front, you get a rocker switch to switch between low impedance and high impedance. So low impedance being 16 to 120 ohms, high impedance being 120 to 300 ohms. There are two headphone jacks on the front, including a 6.35 millimeter as well as a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. The tubes that this guy comes with are 5654W tubes. These are fairly common tubes that you can find out there in the wilds. The other tubes that it comes with are 6AC7 tubes, and these are not to be confused with your 8-pin C6A7 tubes. These are 9-pin Novell or Novel. Yeah, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, but that's as far as I understand. They are a military spec, which is kind of why they look like this, which is like a metal housing. And you can do some research to see if you can find more of these tubes, which I have found online from eBay and other sites, but I'm not entirely sure. My tubes do match. What's kind of unique is that some of the lettering is a bit worn off, which is reflective of them being old or new old stock. I think that the RCA in on the back is probably one of the more high quality RCA jacks that I've ever seen on a device. And then lastly, you just get a standard 12 volt 3 amp power brick. In terms of operation with this guy, I've had this set up in my system as a dedicated preamplifier of sorts, in which I've used my turntable and a number of DACs in front of this. In addition to that, I've used this as a dedicated headphone amp where I've compared it to my niche Piety. And I'll talk about the sound performance of those in just a moment. I was a little skeptical initially when I purchased this if it would actually add any kinds of tube flavor or that euphonics flavor that we get with tubes. But you might be curious, like what is this going to do for your system if you were to integrate this, and not just as a headphone amplifier and how that will affect performance, but how does this perform as a preamplifier? Now, I can only really compare this to my Schiit Freya Plus at the moment. And what I have to say is that this is so close to my Schiit Freya Plus, but if I go back and forth between, say, this and my Schiit Freya Plus, I'm not quite fully getting a sense of difference. And rather, I find this to be so incredibly close to what I'm getting out of my Schiit Freya Plus. So, and for testing purposes, I've used my FOSI Audio V3 monos and, kind of switching back and forth between my Schiit Freya Plus and this, what I'm really think I'm getting in terms of difference in sound quality is that I think perhaps this actually is giving me more tube flavor than, say, my Schiit Freya Plus. And that honestly could be just the difference between tubes. Whereas the tubes I have in my Schiit Freya Plus are presenting themselves with greater clarity, whereas these might not quite have that clarity. However, I feel like, and what I hear with this is I am getting that sense of bloom and that sense of euphonics that you often get with tubes. And so the synergy I found with my V3 monos in this have just been so spectacular. And I'm surprised that not more people have talked about its performance. But for a fraction of the price, we could get a pair of V3 monos and this, and what we're going to get is a very similar price performance to probably another Class D amplifier paired with the Schiit Freya Plus. But the Schiit Freya Plus is over $1,000 MSRP by the time you add tubes into it. And this is only $200. Granted, you're not going to get all of the inputs and you're not going to get 3 different gain settings here. But in terms of flavor, what I'm getting from this is so similar in character. One of the other really cool aspects of this guy is you do have tone controls, and they're not necessarily defeatable with a switch, but there is a center point or a 12 o'clock position where the knob will fall into place and kind of stick. But my interpretation here from what I've seen on graphs and other reviewers, and probably what I'm getting, is that the GR70 has a bit of a boost in its bass. And if you find that it has too much bass, it's really easy to tone that down. And alternatively, you could tone up the treble, to balance out the boost in bass. I think its boost in bass is very welcoming to my KEF LS50s, because there again, those are not bass heavy speakers. And so it does help, I think, flush out that low end ever so slightly. When I have this paired to my topping D53, which I just got in for review, this guy has such incredible synergy with that particular DAC, because that DAC is such a full resolution DAC with so much clarity and transparency that when we add something like the GR70 onto that, the change in sound is more substantial than, say, pairing this with my topping E70 Velvet. And so the synergy there is the best that I've gotten, or rather this has been best paired with my D53. So now I want to talk about its headphone performance. To test this guy out, I've used my HiFiMan Sundaras as well as my Sony MDR 7506 headphones. And what I got in terms of performance when I paired this with my HiFiMan Sundaras was nothing short of probably one of the better listening experiences that I've ever had. There again, I did not expect this DAC, or there again, I did not expect this to have such an incredible performance for this price point. Now, I want to compare the GR70 to the Niche Piety, because the Niche Piety is oftentimes revered or described to have tube-like characteristics. And so I thought that at a similar price point of $189, I think it would be a good kind of comparison. And what I have to say is that I still believe the Niche Piety is going to present itself with some of those characteristics that you will find in solid state gears. I think very quickly I began to realize that the Niche Piety is trying to mimic this. When you go back and forth, you're going to go back to the Niche Piety and you're going to go, well, yeah, this is a tube-like sound, but it's not real tubes. And it's going to become apparent that it's not actually tubes. It's going to sound like a solid state amplifier that then has been EQ'd to have some of those qualities. And in a sense, this is the more pure experience. This is what the Niche Piety is trying to replicate. And secondly, what I'll say about the difference is I think what I'm getting from the GR70, in addition to the bass boost, is perhaps more lushness in the soundstage. There is a better sense of scale and space. And what I'm listening to this, when I listen to an album like La Segunda Noche, which is a Chesky recording, shout out to the Audiophiliac because he talks about this album. But it's an album that was recorded live in a church, and the way that the instruments in the room are mic'd up, you are so immersed in the space. And so listening to an album like that on headphones, where I'm not having to contend with the space of my room, I am getting like one of the greatest listening experiences of my life. And listening to that album, there were so many instances where I stopped dead in my tracks and took off my headphones because I thought my speakers were playing. The scale and the space were so palpable. I was so immersed in a separate location far off into the world, right? It took me there and it transported me to that room on the day the recording was done. And I just don't think I can speak more highly about it other than that. I think its sense of realism just blew me away. I really got the sense of where things were happening in the room. Its reverberation and that moving through the space. If you close your eyes, the space is visualized. And you may or may not know this, but I'm an architectural designer, and so space and architecture are something that I love and I think about. And one of my favorite aspects about music is just that. Music has the ability to etch a room. It has the ability to create space. And a great recording, when you can play that at its highest level, you are then transported to the space of that recording. So live recordings or recordings like that Chesky one are so just incredibly amazing and immersive. And so that is one of the reasons why I've really loved to integrate tubes into my system, because I think that tubes and what they can do for your sound stage and that sense of scale, and at times creating that holographicness or that immersive sound stage where you can pick out all of these things happening, and there's depth and there's width and there's height. That's really what we are going for when we are wanting to listen in an immersive experience. That being said, that kind of listening experience is really difficult to achieve without proper room acoustics, without proper speaker placement, so on and so forth. And then, of course, you get certain recordings, whether it be pop music or certain hip-hop recordings, where those recordings are not about capturing the space of a room. Like, in other words, some music is a person in a vocal booth laying down vocals on a track. And in that sense, the vocals are just intimate. They just are fed directly into your ear without capturing that sense of reverberation and space. And there again, I think tubes have an advantage to those types of recordings, because what they do is perhaps add a little bit more bloom, add a little bit more space back into the track where there might not be that space initially. And again, I think the GR70 has the capabilities of doing that with poor recordings. So, in my testing, this thing has just sounded phenomenal, from everything to poor recordings all the way up to, a Chesky recording. In my conclusions of the GR70, I think that this is a really great budget tube amp. Whether or not you're necessarily looking for a dedicated headphone amplifier, or you're just looking for an external device that you can put after a DAC and try and warm up that sound. I think that for $200, you can go out there and buy this device and start exploring the realm of tubes. I don't necessarily think this might be the best headphone amplifier for tube rolling. What I can find online is there's some Mollard 56, 54s. I think I found Telefunken as well. So you might have a couple options out there for tubes. And if you want to explore the new old stock market, I'm sure there's a bunch of tubes out there for that too. Now, these military ones, the 6 CA7s, you can certainly find a ton of 8-pin 6 CA7s, but as I had already mentioned, these are 9-pin 6 CA7s or novel tubes. I found a couple places where you could buy a couple different ones, but it's not like I'm seeing hundreds of different kinds. So just kind of keep that in mind, that if your intent was to do a ton of tube rolling, you might want to do a little research and do a deep dive online to see what is available. That being said, what you can find is really affordable at less than $20 or around that for a tube. That's nothing, because for like $80 you can swap tubes. Yeah, I just think this is a really, really cool, fun device. If you're somebody that's looking to just kind of play around with color and have some more fun with your system, and you're not like this perfectionist in that sense, I'm really curious what other people think about this guy. And there's a bunch of X Duo. I think the TA26 or TA62 or something like that. That one has a much larger tube, and it also is transformer coupled. And around this same price point of $200, I'm really, really curious to see what that guy sounds like. So I'd like to test that one out next. I'm loving this thing, guys. And I think this is probably going to replace my niche piety, where my niche piety is kind of my fun amplifier, if it were. I think that this is going to replace that as my fun amplifier. So anyways, thanks guys. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting my channel. I really appreciate all of you guys who are subscribing and who are commenting. I really would appreciate the comments on the video, because it really helps the algorithm. But then also, you know, I think as people in this hobby, we love to read the comments on other people's experiences, because I love to get additional input and feedback on what other people have, you know, experienced and what they've paired their equipment with. But more importantly, those comments help other people evaluate the review, and it's another data set if it were attached to my review. So yeah, guys, thanks so much. Hit that like button down below, hit the bell notification, please subscribe to my videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care. Bye-bye. And as well, I think that the art... Ooh. Shit.